She worked hard on that too.
She did.
I found out some really cool stuff.
Oh, what'd you find out?
Well, I'll tell you in a minute, but right now I'm going to use the bathroom.
So what kind of cool stuff did you find at the library?
Well, Kathy and I found some really, really interesting stuff. So we were at this library, the Columbia University Library. We were in the Rare Books collection. The Rare Books collection holds the logs and ledgers from the New York Juvenile Asylum.
This is at the Butler Library.
At the Butler Library at Columbia University. And New York Juvenile Asylum is where my grandfather, Frank Thiel, his older brother Louis, and his oldest sister Frances went to. We know they were there. We find them in the 1900 census. But when they went in and when they left, that information we didn't know. And of course now we found that. We probably found about 15, 16, 17 references in the books to these three children as they went into the system, and then they were moved out of the system to travel west on the orphan train. Probably one of the most interesting documents that Kathy and I located is the logbook where they come into the asylum, where they're led into the asylum. And that tells us quite a bit of information.
Now, is this book like a large book, or is it a small book?
This one was pretty good size, although the largest one I'll get to in a little bit. They were pretty good size. Each child, as they were entered into the asylum, had a whole page, and it tells lots of information. It tells them the date they entered, and they entered on March 10th. It tells them the disposition of why they entered, and it's listed because they had no guardianship. They had no parental guardianship, is what's written in the ledger.
So what year is this?
This is 1900. It also tells us that that their mother's name was Annie, and this is one of the people that we know the least about. This would be my great-grandmother. This is one of the people we know the least about her story. We knew that her name is Helen, or was Helen, legally from some documents. But here she's listed as Annie, and that actually matches the 1900 census, where there is an Annie H. Thiel listed as widowed in an insane asylum. And sure enough, on this document it says her residence is in an insane asylum, that she's a native of Germany, and that her religion is Protestant. This document also told us that there was, and we knew about her, but we didn't know much about her, there was a much, much older half-sister named Emily, or she went by Lizzie, and she is listed in here as a cousin. It gives her address. That also matches the 1900 census where we have her. And it also says that she visited them shortly before they went west. And then it also tells us the date that they went west, which was on June 3rd in 1901. So they stayed in the juvenile asylum. These three children stayed in the juvenile asylum for 14 months. Now, one of the other interesting documents that Kathy and I found, and it was a huge, huge ledger. The ledger must have weighed about 50 pounds. We had to help the assistant get it off the shelf and get it to us.
So were the pages still intact? Was it?
Yeah, some of them were falling apart pretty bad. Some of the smaller books were still intact, but a lot of these were very, very fragile. You had to hold them in a cradle and very carefully turn the pages. The person who helped us, she told us that this particular collection is very much sought after. That lots of people are coming through and searching information, writing books about the orphan trains and about orphanages at the turn of the century. The second book that Kathy and I found is this very heavy book. Is actually the ledger that was kept in the Midwest, in their office, their branch office out in Chicago, when the children arrived on the orphan train. And this is the ledger where they kept an account of who adopted these kids, or adopted is actually the wrong word. These kids were indentured to, that's the term they write, either placed or sometimes they write indentured to whom. And we knew that that Frank and Louis was indentured to, and in fact raised by, Garver Lutz. But we never knew the story of the oldest sister, Frances. And we had thought that Frances stayed in New York, but in fact, no, she traveled with her two brothers to the Midwest. And Kathy was the one who really spotted in her entry that there was something crossed out, and there was actually lettering underneath. And in really close inspection, what the story that it told was that initially she was also spoken for or placed with Garver Lutz along with her two brothers. And the next day something happened and she wasn't. And so then written on top of that is that she was indentured to or placed with a man named Shields, W. Shields. We did a little more investigation, and it turns out that Shields was the agent in the West, and so we think that she maybe was placed there as a housekeeper for the house that New York Juvenile Asylum kept in the West, kept there with W. Shields and his wife as a domestic. So that tells a little more about her story. But perhaps one of the most fascinating clues that was uncovered was, because we know these dates and because we know the exact date they went west, we could go back on the internet, and New York Juvenile Asylum kept, every year they would write a very involved 100-page, 100-plus page book published that was a report to the New York State Assembly. And in there they have photographs. And every group they sent west, they took a group photograph. And that, sure enough, there it is, the group photograph of these 30 children that went west. And in that photograph is the earliest photograph we have of any of these three children, Frank, Louis, and Frances.
How old were they at the time?
Frank was 7, Louis was 11, and Frances was 14 when they went. Now, we have a suspicion of which one is Frank and Louis. On the right-hand side, there are two boys of about the right age, and one has his hand around the shoulder of the younger, the older of the younger. We suspect that's Louis and Frank. We're not absolutely sure, and the next step is to go through the list of all the children and all their ages, and one by one try to eliminate who we know it's not, because this one is too old. Here's two brothers, they're about the same age, we can cross them off and hopefully make a definitive identification that that's those two boys. And possibly also Frances. There's only 5 girls that are of that older age in the whole picture. So hopefully we can assess which one they are.
So your research turned out some very good stuff then.
Oh yeah. I mean, we knew, by the time we went on this trip to New York, we knew quite a bit about what had happened to these children, what their circumstances were, what their parents' story was. But this really brings home the actual details. It affirms some of our theories, so it adds more dimension to it. So it was well worth going and seeing these documents.
So what's the point of all this research?
Well, of course, the first point is curiosity and wanting to know who your ancestors are. But the real reason why we're doing this is we're working towards writing a book. And this book would be a compilation of lots of old family photos. It's really focused on my mother's side of the family, the Thiel side of the family. And while this particular story, the one about the orphan train and my orphan grandfather is a particularly interesting one, the book actually is all inclusive of my grandmother's side as well, and her families, the Dietrichs, the Eakers. We have lots and lots of photographs. So this is the last bit of research, and now Kathy and I and my mother and Leslie will start working on the book.
What are you going to do with the book?
Well, it'll be self-published, of course, but you can do really nice stuff with self-published, and then we'll print out copies. We'll give copies to everybody, to all of the next generation down, so that they've got the family history on their shelves, so as their kids grow up and want to know a bit about who their family was, it'll all be there, the whole story will be there, and all the pictures will be there, and that story won't be forgotten.